Mike's world was shattered when he came home to find his grandmother abandoned on the curb, evicted by two men posing as HOA officials for breaking non-existent rules. The cold-hearted men showed no remorse, leaving her to fend for herself after years of devotion to her family. But when Mike's Marine Battalion arrived, things took a drastic turn, and what seemed like a helpless situation became an opportunity for justice. But just wait until you hear how one man's fight turned the tables, and how, in the end, justice truly prevailed. Part 1. Shock. Mike had just pulled up to the house after a long day. The driveway was quiet, the kind of silence that usually meant everything was just as he left it. But today, as his tires crunched on the gravel, something felt off, an unsettling stillness in the air. He stepped out of the truck and looked up, and there she was, his grandmother, sitting on the curb like an afterthought. Her frail body hunched, her face lined with confusion, but it was the suitcase beside her that hit him the hardest. It wasn't even packed right, just some clothes thrown in, as if she were expected to leave at a moment's notice. "Grandma?" Mike's voice cracked. He rushed over to her, his heart pounding. Two men stood by the gate, watching him with casual indifference. They wore ill-fitting uniforms that bore the logo of the Homeowners Association, but Mike could tell right away something was wrong. These men weren't part of any real authority. They didn't even belong here. "She violated community rules," one of them said, his tone flat and rehearsed, like he'd done this many times before. "No pets allowed. And she's been keeping a dog on the property for too long. We gave her plenty of warnings." Mike's chest tightened, and his vision blurred for a second. "What are you talking about? She doesn't have a dog." "Not our problem," the other man said, shrugging like it was all just a business transaction. "She's being evicted." Mike's pulse raced. His grandmother, who had spent her entire life taking care of everyone around her, who had been a constant, stable presence in this home for decades, was now sitting on the side of the road, discarded. These men didn't even seem to care. There was no empathy in their eyes, no apology for what they had done. They weren't just strangers. They were the kind of people who made rules only for their own convenience, ignoring the real lives affected by their actions. "Get off my property," Mike growled, taking a step forward. But they didn't flinch. They just stood there, like they had all the time in the world. He turned to his grandmother, kneeling down beside her. "Grandma, what happened?" She looked up at him, her eyes a mix of confusion and hurt. "I didn't know what to do, Mike. They said I had to leave. They didn't even give me time to pack." The knot in Mike's stomach twisted tighter. His grandmother was strong. She'd always been. She had raised him after his parents passed. She had never asked for help, never complained. And now they had just thrown her out, like she was nothing. Like she didn't matter. The anger boiled inside him, so fierce it almost took his breath away. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. He wouldn't let this slide. Not for his grandma. Not for anyone. They would regret this. As he helped her to her feet, the weight of the situation settled in. His grandmother, his rock, was now nothing more than a casualty in a system designed to grind people like her down, and Mike was about to make sure that would never happen again. He stood up, turned to face the two men once more, and in that moment, he realized something. The real battle was only just beginning. Mike didn't waste any time. As soon as he helped his grandmother back inside the house, a storm of fury began to churn in his chest. His mind raced with questions, each one more infuriating than the last. Who were these men? Why would they do this to her? And how far did this go? The next morning, Mike started digging. He wasn't just looking for answers, he was hunting down the truth. The HOA, at first glance, appeared like any other local governing body, meant to enforce rules and keep the neighborhood orderly. But what Mike uncovered wasn't just an HOA, it was a carefully constructed scam, one that had been operating right under everyone's noses for years. These so-called officials weren't rogue players. They were part of a larger operation that had been exploiting the entire community, twisting rules to force vulnerable residents into eviction and then reselling their properties at inflated prices. The pattern was disturbingly familiar. Seniors, single parents, people who were just scraping by. They were all being targeted. The HOA rules were intentionally vague, leaving enough room for these men to manipulate and fabricate violations, just enough to push someone out of their home. Mike's grandmother was simply their latest victim, part of a long list of people who had been forced to leave their homes without warning, without justice. The more Mike uncovered, the more his hatred for these men deepened. It wasn't just about what they had done to his grandmother. It was about the systematic cruelty of it all. They had built their empire on people's pain and desperation, preying on the most vulnerable. He felt sick to his stomach. The people behind this didn't deserve to be part of the community. They didn't even deserve to be free. But this wasn't just about anger. This was about justice, and Mike wasn't going to let them get away with it. As a Marine, he knew how to fight. But this was something different. It wasn't a battlefield, and he wasn't carrying a rifle. He was fighting an enemy that hid behind a facade of authority, behind paperwork and legal loopholes. Mike couldn't shoot his way out of this, but he could tear down their empire of lies, one piece at a time. He spent days gathering evidence. He started with the eviction paperwork, digging into the HOA's records, looking for inconsistencies, for anything that would expose the fraud. He called up neighbors, asking questions, making connections. Some were scared to speak up. Others had been silenced long ago. But Mike didn't care. He wasn't about to let fear stop him, not when his grandmother's life was on the line. Every phone call he made, every document he uncovered only fueled the fire burning inside him. He kept coming back to one question. How many others had they done this to? He wanted answers. He wanted them to pay. And then, like a flash of clarity, Mike knew what needed to be done. This wasn't just about his grandmother anymore. This was about exposing the entire scheme, bringing the whole corrupt operation to light, and ensuring that those responsible faced the consequences of their actions. He would not stop until they had nowhere to hide. He wasn't just some angry grandson anymore. He was a Marine on a mission, and this was his fight. And if these men thought they could get away with hurting his family, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. It wasn't just Mike's anger anymore. It was a fire that spread, catching on to the Marines in his battalion, each of them fueled by the same sense of injustice. Mike had always known his brothers in arms were loyal, but this was different. This wasn't a mission of strategy or combat. This was personal. The call came in just days after Mike started piecing together the evidence of the HOA's fraud. His battalion was scheduled for a training exercise in the area just miles away from the heart of the problem. The timing felt like fate. Mike knew it was more than just coincidence. He wasn't going to let this opportunity slip through his fingers. That night, as the Marines gathered in the briefing room, Mike made his move. He stood tall in front of his team, his voice steady, but filled with a raw intensity. "I need your help with something," he began, keeping his eyes on the faces in front of him. "Something personal. It's about my grandmother." The room fell silent. Mike could feel the weight of the moment. These men didn't know the whole story, but they knew Mike, and they knew what he was asking. He explained what had happened, how his grandmother, an elderly woman who had dedicated her life to her family, had been evicted from her own home by a pair of men pretending to be representatives of the HOA. He spoke of the fake rules they'd invented to justify throwing her out, the cold indifference they had shown her, and the underlying corruption that had allowed it all to happen. This isn't just about one person. This is about the entire community being lied to, being taken advantage of. And we all know what happens when someone messes with the ones we love. The Marines exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. Mike could see the anger building in their eyes, the same fire that had burned in his chest ever since that moment he found his grandmother sitting alone on the curb. "Tell us what you need," Sergeant Wilson said, his voice low but determined. Mike didn't hesitate. He knew what had to be done. "We're going to pay a visit to their headquarters. We're going to make sure they understand that no one is above the law." The Marines nodded, each of them understanding the gravity of the situation. This wasn't about military tactics or following orders. This was about standing up to a corrupt system, about showing these men that they couldn't just bully people without facing consequences. The next morning, as the battalion prepared for the exercise, Mike's team slipped away from the main group, making their way toward the building where the HOA had their offices. It wasn't far. The building was a quiet, nondescript structure that looked harmless enough, but Mike knew better. Behind those walls, the kind of injustice they'd inflicted on his grandmother had been going on for far too long. As they neared the entrance, Mike looked at his team one last time. "Stay sharp," he ordered. "We're not here to play games. We're here for answers." With that, they marched forward. The sound of their boots on the pavement was the only noise that filled the air, but to Mike, it felt like the beginning of something much larger. They weren't just walking into an office. They were walking into the heart of a broken system, one that had fed off the suffering of others for too long. The Marines were ready. Mike could feel it in the air, the collective sense of anger, the quiet determination to do what was right. They weren't going to let this go. Not now. Not ever. The building loomed ahead, its windows reflecting the pale morning light. But inside, Mike knew, was the darkness of a system that had broken the trust of its community. And now, with the full force of his battalion behind him, Mike was ready to shine a light on it. The doors to the building were locked, but Mike didn't hesitate. With the Marines right behind him, he kicked them open, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the empty hallway. The fake HOA cops, who had once thought they were untouchable, were now standing face to face with the full force of Mike's battalion. The first thing Mike noticed was the fear in their eyes. They were not prepared for this. The bravado that had once carried them through their deceitful reign crumbled under the weight of the Marines' presence. They were just men, no different than anyone else who thought they could escape the consequences of their actions. But Mike knew, and now they knew, that no one is above the law. The head of the operation, a man named Terry Gable, tried to remain calm. He stood at the front, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his fake HOA badge. "What's this about? You can't just—" Mike cut him off. "We know exactly what you've been doing. Pretending to be HOA officials, evicting people for rules that don't exist. You've stolen from your own community. You've hurt my family." There was a brief silence as Gable's words faltered. The truth was out now, and it was no longer just a claim from one angry grandson. The Marines had the evidence, the backup, and the undeniable force to make sure this didn't go unanswered. "You're done," Mike said, His voice was steady, but the fire of justice burned deep. "You're going to fix this." Gable's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, Mike saw him for what he really was, a coward. With no more lies to hide behind, the man dropped his shoulders and reluctantly muttered an apology. I'm sorry. I didn't think it would go this far. We were just following orders." But Mike wasn't satisfied with his excuses. The Marines were quick to take control, pulling out their phones and documenting everything. They called in the proper authorities, ensuring that the fake HOA cops would face the full weight of the law. But the most satisfying moment for Mike wasn't the arrests or the paperwork. It was seeing his grandmother, finally, after everything she'd endured, walk back into her home. She hadn't seen it in days. Her sanctuary, the place where she'd spent decades raising a family, caring for neighbors, and giving her all to the community. When Mike helped her inside, the first thing she did was sit down in her favorite chair. She let out a long, deep breath, and in that moment, she looked up at Mike, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Mike smiled, his chest swelling with relief and pride. This was more than just a personal victory. It was a reminder of the power that comes when you stand up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. As the Marines gathered outside, watching from a distance, Mike knew they understood too. They had fought their own battles, but this one had been personal, and it had reminded them all of the strength that comes from justice and the satisfaction of righting a wrong. The fake HOA cops were gone. The system that allowed them to thrive had been exposed, and Mike's grandmother was home, where she belonged. It was a win, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been wronged and felt powerless. Now they knew that sometimes standing up for what's right doesn't just make a difference, it changes everything.